So it's 5:30 here in India. So hi everyone, we'll get started here. I'm Sarupya and I'll be your host today. And we have Chris and Satish joining us today on this webinar. And thank you, Chris and Satish. Chris is in Australia, Satish in the US. So bedtime for one and early in the morning, 5 a.m. for the other. So thank you for taking this time out. And Chris here is a very experienced mining consultant. He has tons of experience in underground mining. And he's done it all. He started off as a driller's offsider and worked his way up the chain. And I think you were an operations manager in the last 3 projects, right? In the underground mines in the US.
Yeah, correct. Yeah, I was operations manager for 3 underground zinc mines in the US.
And Satish, you can look up his LinkedIn profile, but he is our digital transformation guru. So he is the go-to guy for anything on digital transformation. So having said that, let's get started here. Today, we are going to cover basically Chris's experience through this transformation journey, where he started, which kind of projects did he do, and what were his experiences, the challenges he faced, the decisions he took. And then I'll also try to weave in other stories that we have come across with other customers as well. So Chris, maybe you can start off with, a little bit about pre-digital times, maybe a decade ago, and what was that first step that was digital? Maybe it was digitizing the e-plods, the daily logs. Maybe you can talk a little bit about that time period.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Sarupya. Yeah, so, what I wanted to start with is just talking about making the decision to go digitalisation. So, one thing I find in the industry, there's a lot of the nice buzzwords that get thrown around. Short interval control, FMS, and vent on demand's a good one. And I find that, people jump on these buzzword bandwagons without sort of really knowing what they can provide to an operation. So, one thing I stress is before you go to digitization, you need to really understand, what are you trying to do? If you want to get a short interval control system, an FMS system, what are you trying to achieve out of it? Because these things, they involve investment into money, and you want to see a return on investment with that. It's crucial. So look at your operation and understand, what are the things that could benefit having such a digitization system. And I think to your point there, the first things you can do is help digitize forms. When I did get to the US, we were still using handwritten paper plots. It was just, a very basic shift planning system. Not that there was anything wrong with it, but they're definitely a better way to do business. So, usually the transition taken over the years is, we start off shift plods, or shift planning sheets by hand, and then they generally people move to Excel-based systems, which is, it's very similar in a sense, but it's digitized. But I have been to places where they're linked to other planning sheets, and those links break, and you end up with a bit of a mess. And I know a poor young engineer who spent half his time fixing macro links in shift planning sheets. And then the next iteration of that is going to a digitized system, where you're able to basically integrate all your systems into one. The big thing about shift planning, which I did want to talk about, is the power of digitization in that process. So, if I go back to again when I got to the US, shift planning was done with one supervisor, in front of a desk, trying to sort his shift out, right? And he's trying to reference, status of machines at any given time. He's trying to, mentally outgoing shift boss is trying to sort of mentally figure out, okay, where do I think this jumbo is in the bolting cycle? Where do I think, did the blasters get this, or the charge up get this heading loaded and blasted, right? So, there's a lot of assumptions made, and one thing I firmly believe is that shift planning process is the most important part of the day. So when I look at the journey we took in the US, by the time we implemented digitization, which was, of course, the groundhog system, we had a shift planning process that was it was integrated with all layers of the mine. So not only did you have the supervisor building the shift, you had the superintendent, the manager at times. I try to keep out of the day-to-day and not piss too many people off, but occasionally I did. You'd have the mine planner there. You'd have the surveyor there at times. So you're making a shift plan based with everyone's inputs, and it's amazing just the simple fact of investing in a nice smart board, which aren't that expensive now, having that in a room where you can all stand around it and make a shift plan. And what I liked, and when we went through the selection process, we had Groundhog was one of the 3 vendors that we looked at, and what was so important to me, and what I always believe is you need to have something really tangible there to build a shift, right? You need to have a Gantt format, right? So you need to have your supervisors, your superintendents understanding how the shift goes throughout the day and plan accordingly. And then you need to be able to have interaction in that process. That's so important. So people need to interact with the board. If we just go to writing out jobs on a bit of paper, those interactions within the mine get lost. So you see where jobs clash. And also the interaction between peers gets lost. So it was very important for me when we went to digitisation that was still a very big factor. And when we look at measuring the impact, it's very important for the outputs of the digitisation to be correct. So mining's generally a game of chasing down the bottleneck. The bottleneck shifting is always what you're trying to hunt down. And as the bottlenecks arise, you want to try and knock them on the head. You create salient actions. You resolve the actions. You track the actions, and then you rinse and repeat, right? And this is the sort of benefits you get out of digitisation. And thanks for bringing that up, Sarupya. That's just an example of one of the first iterations. We got a lot bigger and better and had a dedicated planning room by the time I left. But here's an example, as I mentioned, of the Gantt chart format that the Groundhog platform provided for us. It was customized, which I liked a lot. So to the left of that picture, which you can't see, we started off with a whiteboard and magnets. And I basically said to Satish, like, this is what I want to replicate, because it worked well. I'd spent 12 months as part of the management of change getting the supervisors, superintendents used to planning in a Gantt chart. So I wanted just basically to replicate what we had with all the additional benefits of digitising the system. And just a brief mention on compliance to plan, very important as part of the mining cycle. Poor engineers generally spend a good week building a mine plan, and operations guys, and guilty myself, tend to just not follow it at times. So we track compliance to plan as well as part of this, and a very important piece of the mining cycle. You get the compliance to plan right, and it's very effective. And there's some of the obvious benefits you see with digitisation, that hour of the day, which is usually between 5 or 6 or 6 or 7, where it's, I call it the witching hour, that chaotic time of the day where 2 poor supervisors, it's hardest job in the mine by far. I'll always say that. They're trying to build a shift plan for the next 12 hours with so much information coming in. So, the operator rolls in midway through. He's like, my machine broke down, blew a hydraulic hose. This charge up didn't get to blast this heading. This machine's broken down. Oh, by the way, this loader's had to go in for a service and we forgot it. So think about, when you're digitising, how do I create a system that makes that process easier? Because that important hour of the day where you're building the shift plan is the most important hour when we look at a lot of things, how the ship's going to perform, how our safety outcomes are going to end up.
Right. Sarupya, looks like you're on mute.
Oh, sorry. Thanks, Chris. And Satish, do you want to add about how Groundhog has helped build some of these shift planning and digitize some of this as well?
Yeah, I mean, sure. I remember when we first started out, like in 2014, 2015, with the first version of Groundhog, right? We'd actually been to a mine that had a similar workflow like Chris's had, basically between 5 and 6 in the morning, people just came together in a room and then started filling out the upcoming shift plan on a piece of paper. And then from that, right, I mean, you had to go consult with 4 other people to figure out what the statuses of those machines were and what the statuses of the headings were and whatnot. And for us, we knew how to do software really well. And, whatever they were doing on paper, we first started presenting on a, in a browser in the first version of Groundhog. And from there, we just, kept taking inputs from mine managers, shift supervisors, production planners, and then we came up with these sorts of interfaces to make their life easier, to decongest that, shift handover time, so that you could actually recapture some of that shift handover time and convert that into production time. Basically, the key metric that we were going after was, expanding the effective shift length through using digital technologies. So I think that played a huge role in us choosing a set of UI UX designs to assist all of these miners. Yeah.
And Chris, what were some of the other challenges you faced? Whether it was network connection, things that you had to keep in mind in terms of making decisions when implementing some of these solutions.
Yeah, well, the operation was a fairly marginal operation. So, I've been fortunate enough to work with big companies, small companies, and reality is we didn't have a lot of capital to throw around. So, it's always that decision, what's a nice to have versus what's, essential, or what will create a good return on investment. Obviously the money you spend in these places, they have to be spent well, and they have to show that the money you're asking from a corporate function be spent in the right places. So, the challenge, I guess, first is just, justifying what I knew was going to be a great decision. And, a lot of the, when I look at FMS, short interval control systems, underground's almost the final frontier, right? Ironically, we can, talk to Voyager space shuttle, which has exited our solar system. We can still get communication with that, but we struggle to get communication with the poor driller at the face. And so, we don't have the advantages of underground versus an open pit. Just, plonk a big antenna there, and I know it's not that simple, and no disrespect to the IT guys, because they do a lot of hard work, but, to reticulate a network of Wi-Fi underground, or at least get as much as sort of real-time information as you can, is a challenge. So, early days, we recognised that to, build a multi-million-dollar system where we would have fibre throughout the whole mine and extend it to a working face was really out of the question. That's when Satish and I sort of talked about the peer-to-peer function of Groundhog was something that it was in the latter stages, and unfortunately I left before we got to that point. But how do you create a system where you don't have to, you can get all the benefits of digitization and FMS and short interval control, but not have to spend, if you can't afford it in terms of your operational budget, spend that money to get a very good result. So for me, one of the ultimate benefits I saw was, it's what they call lifting the lid on underground. It's exactly like the open pit. If you can create an environment of digitization where you're lifting the lid and having good oversight over your mine, it's very hard to have oversight when your network of mines spread over 3 mile and encased in half a mile of rock before you get to any of your workings. It's just logistically hard. So when we got to, okay, how do we get as best real-time information as possible? And albeit I would have loved real-time information, but the disciplines around operators calling before jobs, when jobs finished, and of course that takes time. When we look at more benefits around digitization and the FMS system we had in place, is that data, collection of data, and what you do with it. Again, we we can fall into the trap to say we want data, but then again, what are we doing with it? It's so easy to just collect data and do nothing with it. And if that's the case, there's no point collecting data. And the second part to that is what we know in Australia is called shit in, shit out, right? So if the data isn't good, you'll make bad decisions, right? There's a two-pronged approach. You need to get the data, and then it has to be healthy. And the obvious benefit of that is spending the time as a manager or superintendent to analyse over time trends that you're seeing, and of course, and we'll talk about that in a bit later. I'll mention on utilisation of people as one of the key metrics I chose, but to be able to use that, see trends, and then make decisions based on those trends. If you're got more fleet than you require, ask yourself: it's always nice to have that extra loader underground, but do you really need it? It's burdening your maintenance department, and that's an example of a decision I made. Out of this data and the time utilisation models that were customised to our operation, we were very much able to make decisions and park up to, I would have thought, key pieces of machinery that I wouldn't have ever let go, but it was very clear that we didn't need them. And then, of course, the downstream benefits of that is having less burden on maintenance to fix that bit of gear, less running costs, less component replacement cost. Instead of me having to rebuild that thing midlife at $300,000, I could say, well, we don't actually need it. Let's prove that we don't need it, because emotionally, everyone wants to keep their bit of equipment. That's just how it works. So you're taking emotion out of decision making if you can build a few months, of good, honest data.
Mhm.
Yeah.
And I know, Satish, just on this point on data collection, what kind of processes do you suggest to kind of validate the data and get to that point that Chris talked about?
Yeah, what we have seen is, a lot of times mines just want to jump into, full on digital and full on automated data collection and whatnot. And I always say, hey, hold your horses. Let's actually go slow on this, because the first few months you basically want to replicate the paper process with the digital process, and then run them in parallel so that you can actually vet and validate the data. And like Chris said, shit in, shit out, garbage in, garbage out, right? So your supervisors and your mine managers first need to have enough confidence that the process has been replicated and you're actually getting good data, right? So that would be the recommendation, is actually run both those in parallel for a few weeks until you have sufficient confidence in the data coming out of the tool or the software, and then start analyzing the data. Once you find that it's actually good data, quality data, and from then on you can start starting to optimize for maximizing your machine utilization, or even shedding a few assets if you don't need them.
Yeah. So Chris, just on that topic again, what kind of practices or techniques did you put in place? You must have faced challenges throughout this incubation period, right? What kind of things did you do that helped to get to the end point?
Yeah, so when you talk about like implementing such a system, the management of change management is important, and the biggest hurdles you'll face are generally around like the cultural based hurdles. So when I say lifting the lid on underground, it has to be done respectfully. It has to be done respectfully to the workforce, because the first thing an operator, even a supervisor, is going to think is they're watching me, right? It can still be the big bad manager that's viewed in very skeptical light, and that's it's just part of the industry. Over the years, some people may have had a bad experience with a manager, so you get tarred with that brush, and people view you as someone who just wants to watch every move they do. So when you implement these things, it's the first big sell for supervisors especially is making their job easier. This will make everyone's job easier, and I saw that. Right? I saw that one of the first things we did for the supervisor is they would spend about 45 minutes at the end of every shift, even more at times, writing out the physicals, right? So the reportables for that shift, right? How many truckloads from which stope, how many drill meters, how many drill holes. It was a very good reporting system we had there, but it was very sort of administratively burdensome to the supervisor, and they would lose, that good time at the end of the shift that was so important to have, for them to have up-to-date information and to see those operators at the last hour of the day was some of the most important times to be out and about. So with Satish's help, we digitised that process of the daily physical report, and all of a sudden one day a supervisor comes up and I give him that sheet and said, your job's done. And you imagine if I just automatically make their life easier, that's the selling point. So you don't want to start in a position where you're force feeding the high end. Like Satish said, start slow, but you don't want to be force feeding. Okay, I want you to plan your shift via this app. um I want you to be savvy with Gantt formats, and it takes time. It takes time. It's and for me, coming from a blue collar environment, I understand that. I'm from a mining background. People have done mining. If they've done it well, they don't have education in IT. So you have to really show them first this is to benefit, and then that extends to the underground workforce. It's so important to explain to them, like, I'm not being big brother to watch you. Like, I implement these systems. I did implement that system to make a more productive mine, essentially. Like, that is some of the bottom line about what we're trying to do here. We're trying to get insights as to where our inefficiencies are and be able to be more productive. And then, of course, we tie that into the bonus component. Guys, when we're more productive, you get more money, in your bank account at the end of the month. That's no greater motivation for a miner than more money. I mean, there's some weird people like me who just like mining, but for the bulk of people, they're there to, get money. So, you tie that in, and that's the truth, right? It's not stretching the truth by any means. Like, we're using these systems in the right way to create, a more productive, lower cost operation. Now, we'll speak a lot about the safety piece, probably, a bit later in the webinar there, Sarup, because that's very important too.
Yeah.
But, there's some of the challenges I've faced, and I can't stress enough, like, culturally, if your leaders in the group, and the mine manager generally at the top of the pile, but if your leaders, the real leader of the workforce, superintendent, the supervisors, if they're not bought in, like, you're going to face an uphill battle, and guys knowingly, they'll knowingly send you dodgy information. So you don't want to be building business-based decisions based on information that's been altered or not correct, because people aren't happy with you.
Yeah. And that's a good segue to the safety piece as well. There's always the operations, digitization of operation in affecting your productivity, but there's a huge piece where you actually can digitize your safety aspects as well. So maybe you can explain a little bit about that.
Yeah, absolutely. Like, I'm a firm believer that safety really has to be, from the shift planning level, has to be built into the shift plan by design. It's crucial to be able to do that. We do rely on site workplace risk assessments to manage at the front line, but the most beneficial thing you can do in terms of creating safe outcomes for crews is to build a good shift plan. Now, one thing I love about the Gantt chart way of planning a shift is you can see how the shift flows. We asked Satish, can you color code the different tasks? From memory, bogging was yellow, bolting was blue, drilling was a fancy golden color, because drillers all love gold medals, right? So, and by that we could see, so we had a job that we were bogging, and then, we wanted to send the bolter in, or the scaling unit, as what we used over there. We could see if one overlapped the other. It's fairly basic and makes sense, those familiar with Gantt chart formats, but you can see the interactions, right? So the amount you can reduce interactions in the shift planning process is probably one of the biggest things you can do. I was exposed to, there was an investigation on an interaction between a loader and a light vehicle, and everyone was okay. But it was a big wake up call for the operation that, there was interactions there where could have been avoided in the shift planning process. And these are the things, like, you'll build a good shift plan. You'll never know that you stopped a serious incident occurring, but you can give the shift, the best damn chance you can to, to not have interactions. And that's just one of the examples. When you look at hazard management or activities around, say, roadway rehab, it's a good example of, can be very disruptive to the mining cycle. You can plan your shift around that and plan it visually, and that's so important. Here's a good example of, this is more the hazard management piece. So here's a good example. We were utilising Rapid Inspect, which is a hazard management product. Satish was kind enough to give me a trial. And I absolutely love this program. And just, I'm not getting paid for this webinar, just to be clear, but I love this program because it used photography in hazard management. For years I saw hazard management either done on Excel, which is, was okay at the time, or just supervisor comes up and says, hey, Johnny supervisor, there's a rock here in this drift on the left-hand corner. Have a look at it, right? So, the information gets passed, but how effective is it when people are trying to explain 1 out of 100 headings, there's a rock there that might come loose? And, I remember this one fairly explicitly. This was a wedge that was in, and those familiar with underground, a wedge is a 3 intersecting faults that could cause a rock fall. And sure as anything, we took a photo, and, you're seeing the superintendent, supervisor, geologist in there, general foreman. We're sitting around talking about it, and from that, this was in the morning, so the superintendent just come in and seen it, very well seasoned, and we had a very firm plan as to what that was going to look like in terms of remediating that hazard. So now these are the benefits. The additional part I like about digitisation of hazard management is very much the accountability piece. So you have a program where anyone can take a photo, identify a hazard, and then it can be automated to go out to everyone's emails, everyone's phones. The photo can be text message out to the people that need to know about it, and then we can allocate actions, right? And then due dates, like all that stuff's important. I have seen hazard management just become, again, an Excel register in a database that gets referenced once a week, and people bring it up and say, oh, gee, yeah, we didn't do that hazard this week. But, essentially when you're trying to deal with hazard management, probably the most important leading indicator into safety outcomes, you want to do it well. And that's by digitising, essentially, because you think these programs in Rapid Inspect, everyone can have a hazard management tool in their top pocket with their phone, right? But most mines now have relaxed rules around mobile phones because they see the benefit of having them underground to take photos. If everyone underground has a digital system that records hazards, it essentially doesn't cost mines anything because they've got it with them anyway. And you just download an app on iOS or Android and off they go. And then there's some just phenomenal benefit in being able to photograph, track, and manage hazards in such a fashion.
Stage, do you have other examples of hazard management and the LMS training portion of the safety aspect as well?
Yeah, I mean, when we started out, again, one of the first products we actually built was, around miner safety. Miner safety being, I should be able to perform workplace exams and equipment inspections on a phone or on a tablet, right? Because in my mind, a picture is worth 1,000 words. So yeah, all of your forms. I mean, back in the day, pre-digital, people were still filling out their safety inspection cards on a piece of paper and then handing them out to the supervisor. So we said, you know what, you could do significantly better, which is how we came up with Rapid Inspect to also meet with the compliance requirements that MSHA had here in the US. And to that, right, to add to that from a miner safety standpoint, every operator had to have a sign off before they started operating a particular piece of equipment. And most of these things were again tracked on an Excel spreadsheet somewhere. And you know, it's not even funny. I mean, I used to see printouts that were 6 feet by 4 feet, printouts of training matrices. And we said, you know what, you could digitize this whole thing and make it very accessible. You know, the whole angle of miner safety includes training and then providing them the tools to report these hazards, near misses, and even incidents, so that you could do incident investigations faster. Yeah. And yeah, thank you, Chris. I mean, I know you guys tried these things out, so.
Thank you. So jumping back to the operations side, now we've talked about the phase where the initial data collection, getting on board with the digitization. What about advanced technologies? You know, you have all the IoT devices coming out. How do you think those, you know, help? And this is for Chris.
Satish, did you want to take that question?
Sure. I mean, as part of digitization, right, the way we look at it is as 5 stages. One where the first is where you just replicate what you're doing using a call-in type of system. Level 2 is where we have supervisors entering information on behalf of the operators on their phones and tablets. Level 3 is where operators are given tablets or phones and they punch in data. The problem with all of these is, you know, folks might not always punch in the right data at all times. There are people that might game the system. I mean, you should be able to figure that out from the data itself. But then you go to level 4, where you start collecting production data directly from the machines, or from onboard sensors, or from sensors that are installed along the ribs, including RTLS sensors. You know, RTLS sensors being sensors like these, where I can actually track whether that bogger is working at the right stope, right? This is to automate most of the data collection. And like Chris said earlier, right? Garbage in, garbage out, or good in, good out. And a machine never lies. People do, machines don't. And then you also have time series kinds of data from which you can actually do trends and other analysis. In another 10 years, you know, I expect every mine to be digital, and, you know, every mine will have a lot of sensors, most, you know, first on the equipment and then along the other infrastructure as well. Most of the machines that are being bought now are like Teslas, right? They come with all the sensors pre-built. You just activate a license to, you know, unlock new features. And that's how mining equipment is now being built as well, including autonomous mining equipment, right? You are starting to see jumbos that, you know, self-align to a rib, right? So all of that is coming, irrespective of whether you like it or not. So it's better to get onto that bandwagon sooner rather than later, so that, you know, you can ease the transition to a highly digital and a highly automated mine.
And then, so we have all these different types of data, you know, you have ways to visualize it. The challenge remains, you know, how do you make sense of the data, right? And Chris, any examples of how did you go about, you know, identifying your KPIs? What do you want to, you know, see from the data? And data for, you know, showing your management versus your peers, and there's different roles that you have to satisfy.
Yeah, absolutely. Like it gets back to my original point around, you know, you need to be able to understand what you want to do with digitization and an FMS, short interval control system, you know, before you take the plunge into it. It's so important to do. It's we similar to those buzzwords. We hear a lot of things in the industry like equipment utilization is a very common one, and it's a very common metric to track for good reason. But one thing I found at the organisation I was with is we were very tight with people. There was only a certain amount of people we could afford to have in reality, and you ask any manager, they'd love another 10 more people on crew. So I used Groundhog in such a way that I recognised that people and people utilisation was probably one of my biggest bottlenecks of the operation, and how well we use people. And going back to that story I shared, we probably did have too much fleet at a point, and obviously, when you've got too much fleet, utilization metrics probably aren't as sound. U of A metrics are good, but if you can't put a bum on that seat, then what's the point of measuring that metric? So it's one thing I found, it's not very common to measure people utilization in the industry. So I worked with Satish and I asked him, can you build me a time utilization model on people utilization? And that's essentially what we got. So when we looked at the dashboards, and the reports we got, I mean, we got a huge array of information and dashboards, and the modifications that we're able to make to meet site requirements are great. Your standard, tons based, meterage based dashboards, so on and so forth. But the people utilisation was probably the key metric that I used, and generally with our crew size, we'd average initially sort of 100 hours per shift of effective use time. So what we did is every time someone was either attached to a machine or attached to a task, so maybe not a machine, but they're going to help service crew hang some vent bag, right? So is that going to impact your machine utilization? Yes. Is that person getting used effectively to keep the mine running? Yes, right? So that you see the distinct difference between the two. So we utilize that, and I was seeing improvements of like 20-25% in people utilization. So how many effective hours this size workforce was producing. Now, when you go back to the cultural piece, it is so important again to make sure people don't take that the wrong way, that I'm here to see what you're doing and I'm asking more of you. And the lines that I'd use with the crews in pre-start line out meetings, toolbox meetings, were, guys, I'm not asking you to work any harder. I'm not asking you to take shortcuts. I'm just asking, like, let's work effective in the hours that you're on site that you get paid to do. And that's important, because if you send the wrong message that, I'm looking at people and seeing how hard they work, that's the wrong way to approach it. It's a very wrong way. So when we started seeing sort of 140, 150 plus hours of utilization time, one example I can share is we had a shaft-based mine, so we would load the material in an ore pass, we crush it, we conveyor it, we send it up the shaft. Now, when we did the numbers and looked at the data and the amount of material we have to move in a 24-hour period, we only needed 6 hours on the crusher and 6 hours we still had a manual skip tender putting skips up and down the shaft. So straight away my mind goes, well, I don't need 2 operators on day shift, 2 on night shift running crusher skip, right? So we amalgamated either, the 2 roles into 1 on day shift. So we'd spend 6 hours on the crusher, 6 hours skipping, or we just crush on day shift for 12 hours and skip for 12 on night shift. And there's a whole lot more there with power savings on night shift that were very beneficial with the hoist. So, and it wasn't a case, well, we'll, see you later, we don't need you anymore. We were able to utilize that person on a piece of machinery, for example. So straight away, these are the things when you delve into, the data and very much in case of Groundhog, the customized systems we used to meet the metrics that I wanted to see, make very, very informed decisions on being able to be more productive.
I'd like to add something over here. I mean, when you talk about data analytics and driving operator behavior, right? Within the first 6 to 7 months of deploying at a different mine, Chris mentioned earlier that a lot of people think it's none of Big Brother starting to watch, right? So, interestingly enough, at this particular mine, once Big Brother started watching, the night shift production went up 25%, because starting at 1 o'clock, 1:30, the data showed that you started seeing a lot more delays and downs being reported. And then you could start calling people out. Once you start calling people out, I mean, now that you regain those butts and seats actually working in the face rather than, butts and seats waiting for somebody else to come help them out. Right. So, that's some of the things that you can actually do with data.
Yeah, that's great. And just following up on that, so once you have all this data reports, how do you measure the ROI of your projects, and how do you measure whether this has been effective?
Yeah, it's, and I didn't sort of touch beyond the people utilization, but, the reporting is so important. Usually the reports that get produced at a Shiftley level eventually make it into some format to go all the way up to a corporate level, right? They're all the inputs that do that. So, you're reporting on, and generally speaking, what you want to report a safety production cost at a higher level. So, when you go out to invest in a program and to do digitisation, it's important that you obviously build a solid business case. It's the only way to generally justify money when you're asking for a big chunk of capital. And for most businesses, IT of that would be a capital expenditure. So it revolves, creating you do a cost benefit analysis usually. And the hard thing around FMS SIC programs is around, well, it's going to be hard for me to prove tangible benefits. It's very easy to say, I'm going to move from a 30-ton truck to a 60-ton truck, and I'm going to get this payload. We're going to, tram the machine at this speed, and we're going to see, say, the same amount of loads for twice the tonnage. Easy to justify and easy to put in a business case. But when we say, well, what is short interval control going to give us, right? So, you imagine you view a shift it's what's exciting about mining. We start off the day and there's probably a 1,000 permutations the way the shift could go. And what we're trying to do is get to the best permutation to get the safest shift possible, to keep everyone safe and to be productive. It's quite simple. And then, how do I show the tangible benefits of doing that by making micro decisions throughout the day, whether that's your dispatch operator intervening when he or she sees something go wrong, or being able to provide information to the supervisor, which is traditionally the model, alerting the supervisor this bolter operator will be going over an hour of his allotted time because he had a blown hose. So, the supervisor's able to play the chessboard, move the pieces around. So getting back to the point around a business case, it is hard to justify what will happen. My biggest recommendation is there's a lot of research, and I know Satish does a lot of ebooks and publishes papers to show the benefits, case studies of benefits of these operations, and they're probably the best thing to do when we look at justifying. And it's known and accepted that digitisation will allow better performance in operations. But again, it's justifying the money to get to that point. Part of what you have to do as well is once implementations, when you've started implementation and it's new, you need to go back to your original business case and validate those assumptions, right? It's important to do because you don't want someone coming knocking on your door as a manager in 12 months and say, Chris, I gave you a big check for this program. What have you given me? They're the decisions that, usually, send you out the door. So you need to, I guess it's not just do it in 12 months' time, it's proactively see your trends of production over time. Ultimately your job as a manager is to keep a safe operation, build a culture within your workforce, but be a low-cost producer. When you want to be a manager, these are the things that resonate with the higher levels and the people that appoint these sort of people. So, they're sort of your key metrics you have to work towards. So you have to actively understand, is the investment I made in SIC working? And that's gets back to the data. It shows trends over time. I used to trend back 2 or 3 years in production data and look at, tons moved per man hour is a very good one to look at and see how that trended up. And, it doesn't just sit, SIC doesn't just sit in isolation. You usually have two or three things working at once. If I can have a very proactive hazard management system where I stop an operator getting to a job and saying this is too dangerous, I don't want to, versus I can proactively find that, the superintendent can go look at the job, make the decision, understand how we remediate it, and it goes a lot smoother. Those permutations of a shift, it can be 100 micro events that send the shift off the rails. It's not just one thing. And talking around reporting, the variance to the shift is so important. To understand where your shift fell over is important. And 99% of the time, there usually isn't one answer. It isn't, okay, we started the shift, the power went out, we all sat on the surface and drank coffee for a shift. Usually it's a culmination of a lot of little things. So, one thing I found is you'd get to, the morning meeting, and you'd ask the supervisor, how did you go for the day? Good. What were your key variances? You never really ask, did you get your tons? Sends the wrong message. What were your variances? Where did you struggle, in the last 12, 24 hours? And, it used to burn me up inside to hear we ran out of time for the blasters or the charge up to load that heading and blast. Like killed me, because when we look at you look at root cause analysis or 5 whys, you go back a step. Okay, why? So, they're culturally teaching people, okay, let's go back to what actually caused this, right? So to get the information, and one thing was really valuable is the running shift notes, right, of the SIC, to be able to talk in detail as to, issues that happen. But attaching those variances to jobs was so important. You're doing like a mini analysis every day. It's only a short 5-10 minutes with the team, with the leadership team, to understand where the variance was. So we do our 5 whys, we go back, we pop open groundhog, look at the job and say, yes, we understand that, this drill blew a hose. It was a -12 hose and it was under the carrier and it was awful to fix. That delayed him 3 hours. Blasters couldn't get in to the job 3 hours later. They ran out of time. Yes, acceptable. And sometimes it can go back 4 or 5 steps, right? It can be something that happened the previous 24 hours. It could be something happened the previous week, that a job status wasn't updated. So you manage to capture data in real time, live, that's accurate. It smooths those bumps. And again, it helps that get that right permutation at the shift, where you're becoming repeatable. You're dealing with a less variable environment. There's some of the key aspects that allow, digitization and oversight and lifting the lid on the underground to create a very smooth flowing shift. And as always, the supervisors, when they had a fantastic day, they met the KPIs, the metrics, that people were safe, they'll say, oh, gee, that was the easiest shift I've ever had. And that's what you want to see. And the other customization in terms of reporting, we went through a very sizable standardized work initiative, and I'm sure most of the listeners would be familiar with what standardized work looks like. And I went to Satish and sort of asked him, well, we want to create a metric that is basically a scorecard for the site. And how that works is we had about 15 inputs to say, okay, tons moved, meters drilled, compliance to plan, utilization of people, compliance to maintenance plan. So we had all these metrics that were in there, and out of that, we created a scorecard. So what we wanted to see over time is an improvement on that scorecard, and it was a percentage-based system. So of course we started in the 40% from memory. We started 40% here, and here's a score that represents how well our shift was. And then we did see, I know it probably sounds cliche, but we did see a trend over time where we were getting into the 60s, 80%. And that, as a manager, was what, it was a very simple number that I reported to the general manager in a daily meeting. And that was a very effective KPI, because we can get very blindsided by how many tons did you get yesterday. Like, it's a very almost immature, I guess it might not be the right word, but it's a very simplistic metric to look at. So yes, I got my tons for the day, but did I get my development meters that are setting the mine up for the future? So you need to have metrics that are all encompassing, and probably back to your original questions, Rubia, they're the sort of things that I found we could customize to push up the line and report to general managers, VPs, and be able to, put that in monthly presentations to show trend improvement and return on investment.
Yeah, that's great. Satish, do you want to add anything here?
No, not really. I mean, uh, that was a very broad perspective. So no.
Yeah. Yeah. So Chris, you touched upon the aspect of cultural change, right? And clearly the digital world, you need a different mindset. Maybe can you talk a little bit about, what kind of mindset, how should people be thinking about working in this era, digital era?
Yeah, absolutely. Like, I guess there's a couple of parts to that, the operation space and then more the sort of leadership space, technical space. One thing in reflection is, the industry has gone through a, huge transition, and Excel, in terms of the technical space, the administrative space, was the be all and end all. Fantastic program and good in its time. Probably the 90s to the 2000s, was a very effective tool. And one thing I've found, and it was with a previous organisation that was very big, is that if you had like silos departments, every department would want to have a dashboard of some kind, whether it's Excel dashboard, Power BI, and then we got into some web-based dashboards. And the sell to me, I was in the operations space, was, oh, your job's easy because I've created you a dashboard. The problem is, and I actually kept count of this, I had 26 dashboards and touch points to look at. So for the individual department, great, like they've created an easy system, and they're good systems, right? They're easy to use, intuitive. But all of a sudden, you've lumped your operation people, and I'm not crying poor, but you lumped your operations people, with this massive amount of work that you've had to do. And in amongst that, you're trying to get workflow through emails. So you had all these touch points. So, where I see digitization to be most beneficial is getting a system that can amalgamate, integrate everything together. One thing I loved about using Groundhog, and it's a very simple example, but there's all these sort of, I guess you'd say, sort of interlocks in the system, right? So if I use LMS, I'm a jumbo operator. I have a ticket, or in the US, a 5023 for using a Sandvik drill. Now, all of a sudden, the supervisor wants to put me on the EpiRock drill. So he allocates that in Groundhog, but then gives you a, sorry, can't do that. Chris isn't ticketed to do that. And I understand how it happens. Life-saving rules for most mines say, thou shalt not operate a bit of equipment that you're not signed off to use, right? But in amongst that witching hour of the day, you can understand how these little things can slip. They do, we're human, and when we're getting bombarded with information to build a plan for 10, 20, 30 people and try to get KPIs like these, it's very understandable how a supervisor would miss the fact that Chris is a driller, but he's not ticketed on this specific drill. So to have those little interlocks in the program, like you're digitizing and trying to remove human error out of this process. You and if you can do that, like you're winning. And again, that's safety by design. Like that's a way that you can ensure that, okay, I haven't inadvertently put someone in a position where they're going to break a life-saving rule. Like, tick, done. And you won't even know it's happened. And you won't even know that you could have prevented something, but it's done by design within a system. It's similar with, the hazard management I like to talk about. Again, one of your key leading metrics in terms of safety management, risk management, fatal risk management is being able to just do these things smoothly, right? So, I allocate someone, and we did this with Rapid Inspect. You can, allocate someone to do a critical control observation, right? So I can allocate in their calendar to say, well, on Thursday, Steve, supervisor, you'll be doing an observation on installation of ground support, right? So there's no surprise. It just becomes smooth flowing, becomes predictable. The other point I wanted to make, and it's a very good expression in the mining industry, is when you take the leap to go to, say, an all-encompassing program, you'll invariably get people that say to you, oh, gee, well, we've got this report, that references out of this spreadsheet by this macro, what are we going to do here? And that happens a lot. Like I remember rewinding back the clock, previous operation, the surveyors were worried that their monthly data pool of meters weren't going to be there. And, this production report for the PA of the general manager said, oh, I'm not going to get these metrics. My best advice, and the expression I use in the industry, is turn the tap off and see who comes back Thursday, right? So just, be bold in your assumptions. Don't try to please everyone, because a lot of the times, I don't know, there's a macro sending that file automated to that person, right? So just turn it off. Obviously, you want to do a management of change and understand when we swap over, are we exposing anyone to any significant risk? But more often than not, these are administrative processes. If a general manager goes without a report for 24 hours because the data doesn't pull, he'll be okay, right? I guarantee he'll be all right. It's nothing. So turn the tap off and see who comes back Thursday. And what also that does, it gives you a clean slate, right? So was there an automated email that sent to 50 people and out of them 45 people aren't at the site anymore? So clean the slate, clean up your processes and start from scratch. Don't try to appease every process in your mind. Like, be bold, make a decision, jump, and jump, because digitization has proven to be a very effective tool. And for a lot of people, it's, especially in Australia-based industry, the benefits purely on the safety piece are huge, and then also the benefits of productivity are huge. The one more thing I wanted to share, which is, I do like to talk about analogies every so often, so be patient, it's an old proverb, and Satish, I think it may be Indian, I'm not sure, you correct me if I'm wrong, but it's about sharpening the saw. So imagine there's a guy, he's subsistence living, he's living in a house, and his wife said to him, Chris, go down and chop us down a tree. We need wood to cook our food, and we need to keep the house warm so the kids don't get cold. Fair enough. So out Chris goes with his saw, and he starts chopping down the tree. He's sawing and he's sawing away, and it's slow. It's a big tree, and it's slow. And an older, wiser gentleman walks past and says, what are you doing? I turn around, or Chris turned around and says, well, can't you see, you idiot? I'm cutting down a tree. And he says, why don't you take a break? Why don't you take a break and sharpen your saw? You'll cut down that tree faster. And Chris turns around and says, I don't have time to cut down a tree. Can't you see I'm busy? Right. And if I'm to look at my experience in mining in Australia, everyone is busy. I think it's a personal belief, it's a function of high wages, and people wear a lot of hats with what they do, and they are busy. But sharpening the saw, as analogy, is take the time to step back. That email can wait, right? That email can wait. Take the time to step back, sharpen your saw, look at your operation on a macro level, and see how it functions. Understand what digitization can do for you before you make the decision. And don't make the decision flippantly. Make it based on what you need, what you'll get out, and how well that investment will return in terms of safety and productivity uplifts.
That's a great piece of story there, Chris. We're almost at time, and we have Satish, you wanted to add something?
Yeah. On the question of cultural change, right? And I'm dating myself. I mean, at one of the sites we were first at way back in 2016, right? We saw a few issues with adoption to begin with. And, when you start talking to all these supervisors and whatnot, right? The feeling that I got, and this was expressed verbally directly to me, is, I'm out here trying to look out for my guys' jobs. So there's a inherent belief that digitization may take away jobs. And you have to also express, as part of your communication plan, right? You also have to communicate pretty clearly and pretty consistently that, hey, we will get more jobs if we digitize, because, hey, we're going to be lowering our overall cost of production. So it means, we should be able to produce more, which means there'll be more jobs, not fewer. So we have to be cognizant of what people are thinking, especially supervisors. The operators are going to be fine because every mine needs the operators. It's, a supervisor that used to spend 2 or 3 hours writing reports now all of a sudden says, well, does this mean I'm going to get replaced? Right? You have to be addressing those questions, those thoughts in people's minds. Cultural change, cultural as in behavioral change, right? It's very important, and change management goes a long way in easing the adoption of new technologies at mine sites.
So thank you for that. We just have about a minute, and there are quite a few questions. So what we're going to do is take those questions offline and then respond back to everyone who asked those questions. But before we wrap up, Chris, maybe one thing that you want the audience to take away, you know.
Yeah, when you're managing, I guess go back to a point is your job as a mine manager. For those that are aspirational to be a mine manager, is keep your people safe, build a good culture, and be a low cost producer. That's sort of the secret sauce. It sounds simple in face value, but it's a bit trickier. And the last thing is just be bold in making decisions. Don't hesitate. When you know you've done some good homework, you've done your research, you've got good data. Be bold in making decisions.
Satish, do you want to add anything here?
You can't get any better than what Chris just said.
Yeah.
Be bold, make
Yeah.
decisions.
Yeah.
You know, turn off that tap, see what happens.
Yeah. So thank you guys. This was really interesting, hopefully very informative to everyone here. We will, in terms of housekeeping, we will send you a recording and we will try to answer all the questions that have come through in the next few days and get back to you with the recording and the answers to the questions. Okay. Thank you, everyone. Thanks, Chris. And thanks, Satish. Thank you for your time. Bye.